Thank you very much, Wally, and it's I'm very happy to be back here in South Africa. I've been here many times, and in the work that we do. And like Wally said, I'm with the Indigenous Environmental Network, which is a grassroots-based Indigenous Peoples organization. We organized over 20 years ago around the issues of environmental injustice within our indigenous territories of North America. As indigenous peoples, in 1990, we were facing a whole onslaught of industry-directed, governmental-directed developments that literally were resulting in the percolation of toxic chemicals coming up out of the ground. But related to that, is the issue of extractive type of industry that had been allowed to come into our indigenous territories. Not that much different than what has happened historically with colonization in different regions of the world. And one of those biggest issues that we've been dealing with as indigenous people is deforestation. Deforestation in the United States and deforestation in Canada as well as Alaska. Often without no monitoring, no protection mechanisms that were really protective enough to stop logging and stop also mining, because sometimes in mining they clear out the area and deforest the area. We're experiencing now that issue in Canada, in Alberta, in the province of Alberta, Canada, called the tar sands. And that's part of those of you that study forests. There's the boreal forest that extends all the way in a certain area of Mother Earth, certain in the northern territories of Canada, extends all the way into Russia. The boreal forest is very rich in its biodiversity, yet not rich enough that the government of Canada is protective of the boreal forest, because they allow it to be literally clear-cut, bulldozed, the soil pushed back so that they can mine into the earth to get to the sludge-like oil called tar sands, a bitumen type of material. And so there has to be the destruction of the terrain. So I'm leading this to give you an overview. For myself, I come from northern, kind of north-central United States in what's called the Great Lakes. It's a forested region, and it's in the state of Minnesota where I live. We're not that far from the Canadian border. And why I want to show this picture is that this has been the policy of the United States government for, I would say, 100 years. 100 years. But we have to look back as indigenous people from the United States, because we go back to the time that the Pilgrims had arrived in the 1600s. Before that, Columbus had landed south of us along the Atlantic coastline in 1492. But if you go up the coastline, the Atlantic Ocean, you go to what's now Massachusetts and England, the Pilgrims had arrived. But during that time, in that era, in the 1600s, there was this effort that actually came from Europe and started when Columbus was arriving in 1492 with these big ships, that in our analysis, one of the reasons was that this was a business venture to extract the trees. In Europe, there was complete removal of the old forests, the ancient trees and the native trees. So trees was one of the reasons of colonization and extraction of our natural resources as indigenous peoples. Why I show this picture and leading to what I want to talk about is how did this policy as a practice affect us as indigenous peoples culturally? It's very important. So as a policy that started in England in the landing of the colonists coming from the east direction, moving, I'm sorry I wasn't able to get some slides together. I can draw it on the board, but that's going to take time. But starting from the eastern part of the United States as a part of a continent of North America, imagine a movement of the 1600s, 1700s, 1800s, 1900s as we go into the year 2000 to where from the east all the way to the prairie lands. Where I live is at the edge of the woodland forested region of the United States that comes from the east coast all the way to the Midwest, the middle part of America. From there it's prairie land, and then the Rocky Mountains. So up to the prairie land, the policy was clear-cut. You heard cities of New York City, Boston, Detroit, Chicago, all these big cities. The development of these cities, they needed timber to build the homes. And so they needed railroads to part of the trade and commerce and to ship grain and commodity to the ports. So part of the policy was to devastate and to wipe out the trees, and this is what they did. Where I come from in Minnesota, if you go back just into the early 1900s, the late 1800s, all the rivers, since we come from an area that they call land of 10,000 lakes, that is one of the names of our state, the land of 10,000 lakes. As you go north in northern Minnesota, most of that is forested area. In the late 1800s and the early 1900s, this policy devastated not only the terrain and the ground, but also the waterways. The rivers and the lakes were flooded with cut timber. The rivers, the lakes and the rivers were the roads to get the timber to the sawmills. And that was choking out the fish population. So not only was the devastation to the ecosystem, there was devastation to our food system, choking out the food. Many of our people in those years were still subsistent, dependent on our natural foods. We didn't go to grocery stores, we were dependent on the natural food system as early as the 1900s. So with this as a policy, to extract the richness of the timber in my homeland, the question is what happened to our people in that time period to now, okay? And this is what I briefly want to talk about. The type of trees we have in Minnesota during that time was this really rich biodiversity. Our tree species were white pine, red pine, birch, hardwoods like maple, ash. There are softwoods like aspens. We call them popple, but aspens, spruce, different kind of species of pines. But cedar was one of the really prized trees of our culture. The cedar trees was used for ceremonial purposes. And all these were basically wiped out during a certain period of the early 1900s to build the homes and the industry, the businesses of settlers in the state of Minnesota. The railroad system with their easements to build roads. Railroads also were part of of that devastation that took place. One of the families, the Weyerhaeuser family, and other timber companies, Champion, Potlatch, but the Weyerhaeuser were friends of the railroad industry, and so they used to vacation and go all around the Cape of South America and actually come over to Africa. So there was some of these elites, these people that had money that was earned at the expense of our indigenous peoples. So what happened to us culturally? What happened to us? Let me bring up to the modern time here, because when this happened, is that they completely devastated a rich and diverse ecosystem like what Simone was talking about, the richness of biodiversity. One thing that happened is that when they clear cut, more sun came into the area. The temperature of the soil went up. So the runoff from the water hitting the soil, the temperature now is warmer, and that was another way that caused that affected our fish population. Okay, the temperature of the water went up. And when this happened, there's a lot of softwoods, aspens, and they have a lot of roots, sucker roots, and these roots started to become dominant, choking out any natural process for regeneration, Mother Earth's process of regenerating and restoring what had been devastated. These root systems growing under the earth, so that now, to this day, aspens has become the dominant species, the softwood. So mining take into account the market, take into account the need for society to have paper, the need for society to have plywood or oxboard in order to build homes. The industry started to look at softwoods. So softwoods became a dominant species. It wasn't in the best interest economically for the state of Minnesota, where I live, the government to put money in restoring what we call our native forests. There was no effort to restore the white pines, the red pines, the cedar, the birch, but the market demand was for softwoods, and still is softwoods to today. The softwood feeds the pulp and paper mills, okay? And the softwood feeds the plywood, the chipboard, where they chip the softwood, they use chemicals, they paste it together, these big pressing boards, to make these sheets of plywood for the building industry. And the chemicals that come out of this process in oxboard, and the chemicals that come out of the pulp and paper mill, the dioxin has been another really serious health exposure to our people. It's an endocrine disruptor. It affects the health of our people and all people. So that's another compounding change, another issue of that's connected to when we talk about forests. Culturally now, what has happened to our people is that as Native people, we have a relationship to the environment. Many of the people in my area have clan relationships, or totems relationship, clan relationship. I have a close relationship to the bear, the animals, the bear. Some families have a relationship to the eagle. Some families have a relationship to the marten or the otter. So different animals is our history, our identification through clans. My relationship to the bear is that when this is still the policy of clear cutting, is that it pushes the bear population, the bear families, further back into other areas to where an area has not been clear cut, so they are running out of homes to live. So there's been a decimation of bear population where I live, and now we have garbage bears. We have garbage bears who really are homeless, and now they go into the dumpsters because they're also being impacted by clear cut. Now, also like what Simone said, we also experiencing plantations, even age stands. In Minnesota, we got the big timber companies, and they're in the market of getting more wood. Okay, they really wiped out our natural species, our natural stands. So they have these tree farms. And if you ever look in Minnesota, come to my area, you'll see these tree stands. They're really nicely, just like when the farmlands, how they till the soil and they plant the crops, they're all in rows. That's what we have in Minnesota, is these tree farms. They're even age stands, meaning at the tips of the trees, they're usually at the same level because they were all planted at the same time. Now, we're concerned about this because this has affected our relationship to the bird nation. They have actually found in even age stands that the predatory birds are the ones that become the dominant species and more populated species, while the songbirds do not thrive in even age stand areas. And that's why in some of our tribes that are connected to the birds are seeing the differences that has happened within the past 50 years in the relationship to what bird species thrive and which ones perish. Songbirds versus our predatory birds. Another finding that we found in Minnesota in this now overpopulation of this dominant species of aspens or poplarwood is that it requires more calcium from the earth. And so now there's a depletion of calcium in the soil. And then also the raising of the temperature, again, is a big issue. Lyme disease from wood ticks. And now when I said the dominant species through these sucker roots that have taken over under the ground of the softwood aspen, it's created this thick underbrush of softwoods called aspens or popple. And in these areas, I'm talking like the state size, vast amounts of area, large amounts of area where this underbrush, where this softwood is coming back, not coming back, but where it's growing. And in these areas are these wood ticks. Wood ticks thrive in this area. So now as a result of these little wood ticks, we get Lyme disease. So it's affecting a lot of our people as well as non-Indigenous peoples. Culturally, again, the result of clear cut has affected and devastated a lot of our traditional cultures. The way that we live in the environment had been altered. Taking the trees, we weren't able to get any more of the large birch trees to make our canoes. We used to make canoes from the birch trees. And now with the birch trees, a lot of them are not surviving more than 30-year stands are falling, drying out. Birch is really hard to get, so we're not maintaining a lot of our old practices. For us as Indigenous peoples of North America, it's very important that we retain our culture. Part of the colonization, colonialism, and the role of government and even the church has been to marginalize our cultural identity as Indigenous people, forcing our children not to speak our Indigenous languages, forcing us to forget our traditions. And within the past 30 years, it's been a priority to revitalize our language, revitalize our culture, revitalize our unique relationship to the environment. So when the environment looks like this, It's really challenging to revitalize that cultural heritage that we have a right to when the environment looks like this. There has been shifting from a clear cut to select cut practices, but that's still just beginning here in the modern time. In 2012, it still has not been embraced as a governmental policy. Like I said, the tree plantations is usually something that the government, the industry wants to promote. It's too costly for them to initiate these revitalization of our old pines and they say it's too costly. It would take human labor to go out and clear out the brush, and that's just too expensive for the industry. There's not a value to that. They'd rather continue the softwoods. There are some pines, pine plantations, and like what Simone said is a big issue with us. Usually now the pines are no larger than 4, 5, 6-year-old pine stands, and those get cut. Fence posts and other products that we need pine for. We have very few old stands anymore. You know, if you come to my area, there are some large stands of pines about that much diameter at the base. In our indigenous way, we have a word for trees, chan oyate. These are people. These are people at tree stands, but we say that there's no more elders. There are no more elders of trees. So we say in our indigenous way, with the practice of tree farming, tree plantations, with practicing this clear cut, we say that there's a lot of children of trees growing up, little saplings. But we say, who's teaching them on what they need to know to be a healthy, thriving tree? They have lost all their elders. The practice in our country is to kill out the elders. And so that's something that's very precious to us, is the protection of these elder trees. We do have some tree stands maybe about this that you will see in these protected reserves called national parks or state parks. Usually they've been left behind by the logging industry during the past 100 years because they weren't the type of trees that they were looking for. They were looking for straight stands, and they're crooked. They're crooked. You know, they have a bend in it or something that wasn't worthwhile for them to cut down. So we have a couple of those types that you will see. But climate change is another big factor affecting us in Minnesota with drought conditions that is coming down into the Great Lakes area. And this is a rich area of 10,000 lakes. We do have certain periods of drought now that is coming into our area. We also have different bugs and infestation of different tree diseases that is coming that is related to the temperature changing. So we're really worried about where we are going in the future of protection of our natural native trees. And also, again, the revitalization and the link that we have as Indigenous people culturally. But it's not just culturally, it's spiritually, a spiritual relationship to the trees. There's a woman who has studied this situation about depression, about suicide, about the social, psychological impacts of the negative impact of devastation and development of our natural resources. And in that paper says that our people, our youth, our kids are still experiencing a loss of what was. Our kids may not know how it was during the time when there was a thriving, natural, forested world. We used to say we got 4 levels. 4 levels in the forested. We have 4 worlds in our forested area. And what that means is that we had a canopy. We had a canopy in our forested area where there's that many different levels of tree levels and different species, 4 levels of canopy. That was what used to be in Minnesota, Wisconsin, southern Canada, and that whole Great Lakes area. We don't have that anymore. We just don't have that. And we have to always link to what Simone was saying, is that the biodiversity, the richness of the biodiversity that thrive in these type of healthy forested areas is very critical. And it is linked, in my observation and analysis, linked to building a healthy community, a community with well-being. Is that if we are constantly experiencing the devastation to our ecosystem and now forests, that will have effects socially and psychologically and culturally to our people.